Imagine this. What if the most famous painting in the world was hiding a truth older than the Bible itself? There are stories the world remembers, and stories it was never meant to hear. Some lie buried beneath the dust of time. Others are locked behind doors that never open. But every so often, a whisper escapes. A secret slips through the cracks of history. Softly, quietly, as if the past itself cannot bear the weight of silence any longer. Tonight, you will hear one of those whispers. A story that begins not in the shadows of fiction, but in the quiet corridors of power, within the heart of the Vatican itself. They say the Church has always guarded mysteries, holy relics hidden from the unworthy, manuscripts sealed by papal decree, truths so dangerous they were forbidden not because they were false, but because they were true. And centuries later, when a man named Dan Brown wrote a novel called the Da Vinci Code, those buried whispers seemed to rise again. What was meant to be fiction began to sound uncomfortably like memory. The Vatican called it blasphemy, but others called it revelation. Was it really just a story? Or was it a mirror held up to secrets long denied? To understand the answer, we must go back, far beyond the pages of a book, to the earliest days of faith and fear, to a church struggling not just for souls, but for control. In the beginning, the church was not yet a fortress. It was a fragile flame flickering against the darkness of empires. But with time it grew, from a movement into a kingdom, from faith into authority. And like every kingdom, it learned that power demands secrecy. The first libraries of the Vatican were not open to the public. They were sanctuaries of silence, filled with scrolls, letters, and records that told stories different from the ones preached at the altar. Some said these archives contained lost gospels. Others claimed they hid proof of forbidden truths, truths that could change how the world saw Christ and the church that followed him. For centuries, few dared to question what was hidden there. But in the modern age, curiosity is a spark that cannot be contained. And when the Da Vinci Code appeared, that spark became a fire. The book told of symbols and codes hidden in paintings, of secret societies guarding the bloodline of Christ, and of a church that had erased the sacred feminine, burying the name of Mary Magdalene beneath centuries of doctrine. To some, it was thrilling fiction. To others, it was dangerous heresy. But to the Vatican, it was a problem, because buried within that story were fragments of things the church had indeed tried to forget. Ancient manuscripts once condemned as heretical, writings that spoke of Mary not as a follower, but as something more, a partner, an equal. The Vatican has always denied these claims. Yet, the timing of its silence is curious. Each time such questions rise, doors close, records vanish, and scholars find their paths mysteriously blocked. What is it the church fears? A loss of faith? Or the revelation that faith itself was rewritten? The truth is that the Da Vinci Code struck a nerve not because of what it invented, but because of what it reminded the world to question. It whispered that art could be a language of rebellion, that the canvas of Da Vinci was not merely beauty, but code, and that behind every saint and sinner, there lies a story rewritten by those who won the right to tell it. But here, in the stillness of night, when the noise of the world fades, and only your thoughts remain, ask yourself, why does fiction make the powerful tremble? Why does imagination awaken such ancient defense? The Vatican called the novel a threat to the faithful. Yet faith, if true, fears nothing. Truth, if pure, needs no protection. So perhaps the real question is not what the story said, but what it almost revealed. What if the legend of the Holy Grail was never about a cup, but about a lineage? What if Da Vinci's art concealed not just symbols, but history itself? And what if somewhere in those endless archives beneath Rome, there lies a document that confirms it all? You can almost hear the echo of the past if you listen closely. The soft rustle of parchment, the faint hum of candlelight against stone, the heartbeat of a secret that refuses to die. For centuries, the church has written erased, rewritten again. But no matter how many times truth is buried, it leaves fingerprints, in symbols, in art, in whispers that find their way to dreamers like you. Here tonight, as you drift deeper into the story, remember this. What you are about to hear is not accusation. It is exploration. A journey into the spaces between history and faith. Between what was said and what was hidden. Because sometimes the greatest truths are not shouted from pulpits. They are whispered from the shadows. And if you follow those whispers long enough, they lead you somewhere the Vatican does not want you to go. Somewhere behind the veil of holy art, where angels look down with knowing eyes. And a painter once dared to tell the truth, not with words, but with brushstrokes. And so begins our journey into the forbidden truth. A truth the Vatican cannot erase. A truth hidden not in legend, but in the masterpiece of a man who saw too much and spoke too softly for the world to understand. Until now, to understand why the Da Vinci Code unsettled the Vatican so deeply, we must first return to the time before the novel, before the theories, before the world had even heard the name Dan Brown. Because the story that shocked the church in the 21st century was born from whispers that began in the 12th. It began with an idea that beneath the surface of Christian history, there existed a hidden current, a truth too radical for its time. The church called it heresy, but others called it revelation. It was an age of knights and crusades, of sacred relics and forgotten books. And within that chaos rose an order unlike any other. The Knights Templar. To most, they were holy warriors sworn to protect pilgrims. But to some, they were guardians of a secret so dangerous it would one day cost them everything. They were said to have uncovered something during their years in Jerusalem, something hidden beneath the Temple Mount, a relic, a document, or perhaps a truth. Whatever it was, it changed them. It gave them power beyond measure, not through gold, but through knowledge. And knowledge, in the eyes of power, is always a threat. The Vatican watched them grow in wealth and influence, watched kings bow before them, and slowly, unease turned to fear. Then came the night of betrayal. Friday, October 13th, 1307. At dawn, the Templars were hunted, arrested, tortured, their order erased in fire and confession. But not all secrets burn. Some scatter like ashes, carried by the wind of centuries. And that wind would blow across time, whispering through the cracks of art, until it found its way into the hands of a man who painted truth as beauty. Leonardo da Vinci. He was not just an artist. He was an observer of secrets, a man of faith, but not of blind obedience. In his notebooks, he wrote in mirror script, as though his words were meant to be seen only by those who truly looked. He painted what others dared not imagine. A world where divinity was not confined to men. And in his masterpiece, The Last Supper, some believe he hid the most dangerous idea of all, that the figure seated beside Christ was not the Apostle John, but Mary Magdalene herself, the woman the church had long called a sinner. Yet some ancient texts describe her as the apostle to the apostles, the first to see the risen Christ, the one he loved most. If that were true, then the foundation of centuries-old dogma begins to tremble. Because if Mary was not just a witness, but chosen one, then the church's story was never complete. In Leonardo's painting, their bodies form a shape, a hidden V, the ancient symbol of the feminine. Between them, an invisible chalice, a symbol of the Holy Grail. But perhaps the Grail was never a cup. Perhaps it was bloodline, flesh and memory, not gold and stone. The church, of course, called this nonsense. They said it was art, nothing more. But art has always been a language of silence, and Leonardo spoke it fluently. For centuries, his work was studied, copied, praised, but few saw what might have been staring back at them. The suggestion that divinity was shared, that God's reflection was not only male. When Dan Brown wrote the Da Vinci Code, he merely connected the dots that history had already drawn. The Vatican's anger was not over his imagination, but over his accuracy, because the symbols were real, the archives were real, and the idea that something sacred had been hidden was older than the church itself. For years, scholars whispered about missing gospels, texts that spoke of love and partnership, of Mary not as a fallen woman, but as a teacher beside Christ. Among them were the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, ancient manuscripts discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945, part of the Nag Hammadi Library. Their words were unlike anything found in the New Testament. They spoke of balance, of unity, of wisdom belonging to both man and woman. One line read, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and used to kiss her often on her mouth." The church dismissed these texts as Gnostic blasphemy, but the timing of their disappearance and rediscovery is a story that still raises questions. Because for nearly 2 millennia, these writings were known to exist, and yet the Vatican never mentioned them. When they were found, scholars noticed something unsettling. Certain lines had been carefully erased, names missing, meanings altered. It was as if someone long ago had tried to edit not just scripture, but memory itself. And this, perhaps, is why the Da Vinci Code shook the world. Because beneath its fiction was a reflection of something the church truly feared. The possibility that its version of history was not the only one. Imagine for a moment, if the early church truly did suppress the feminine divine, if Mary's role was deliberately diminished, then what else might have been hidden? What other truths still lie beneath marble floors and candlelit corridors? The Vatican says such theories are dangerous, but danger is often the shadow of discovery. The novel may have been a story, but the reaction, the urgency of denial, the condemnations, the interviews, the fear, told another story entirely. Because no institution fights fiction so hard, unless it touches something real. And that is where the mystery deepens. For behind the art, behind the text, behind the gentle brush of history, there remains an invisible thread, connecting painter to poet, symbol to secret, fiction to forbidden fact, a thread that leads, inevitably, back to the one place in the world where secrets are not lost, but kept, the Vatican archives, miles of shelves beneath the city of Rome, scrolls, codices, sealed envelopes, some never touched by modern hands. It is said that within those walls lies the evidence of centuries, letters from kings, records of trials, and perhaps the truth of Mary Magdalene herself. But access is forbidden. Only a handful of scholars may enter, and even they are watched. So tonight, as you rest in the quiet, imagine that underground labyrinth, the air thick with dust and memory, the silence heavy with things unsaid, and somewhere in the dark, a single parchment waiting to be found. The world has always searched for the Holy Grail, but maybe it isn't an object at all. Maybe it's a story that refuses to die, a truth that cannot be buried, no matter how deep the vault. And if the church has spent centuries hiding it, perhaps it's because the greatest secret of all was never about power, but about love. The night is quiet now, the candles burn low, and the air feels heavier, as if the weight of time itself lingers in every breath. You've heard of the book, you've seen the symbols, but few have ever looked deeper, beyond the story, into the history that breathes beneath it. Because behind the Da Vinci Code lies something older than fiction, older than the church, older, perhaps, than faith itself, a truth carefully hidden under layers of scripture, secrecy, and stone. For centuries, whispers have surrounded Leonardo's art, the Vitruvian Man, the Last Supper, the Virgin of the Rocks, each painting a message disguised as beauty. But what if those whispers were not imagination? What if Da Vinci truly encoded forbidden knowledge in his art? Let us begin with a painting most people never question, The Last Supper. For 500 years, millions have looked upon it, admired its perfection, its silence, its serenity. But Leonardo was not painting peace. He was painting tension, chaos at the moment Christ reveals his betrayal. And within that chaos, he hid something, not a word, but a pattern. If you trace the hands and gazes, you'll notice something remarkable. No chalice sits upon the table. The Holy Grail, the most sacred relic of Christian legend, is missing. Why would Leonardo, so meticulous in every detail, omit the object around which the entire moment revolves? Unless the Grail was not a cup at all. Look closely at the figures of Christ and the person to his right. A delicate, almost feminine face, long hair, a serene expression. Their bodies form the shape of the letter V, the ancient symbol of the sacred feminine. That shape, that emptiness between them, is the Grail. Not an object, but an idea. Not something to be found, but something that was lost. The church calls it coincidence, but history calls it pattern. Across centuries of sacred art, the same symbols appear again and again. The triangle, the hidden hand, the juxtaposition of light and shadow, each one telling a silent story of balance, unity, and a forgotten divine. Leonardo was not alone in this secret language. He was part of a lineage of thinkers, artists, and seekers who believed that truth could be preserved not in words, but in symbols. Some say he belonged to the Priory of Chaon, a secret brotherhood said to have protected the bloodline of Christ. The Vatican calls it myth, but myths often begin where evidence ends. The earliest records of the Priory's existence appear in the 12th century, around the same time as the Knights Templar. Their symbol was a simple cross interwoven with a fleur-de-lis, a mark of royalty and sacred femininity. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the names of their supposed grand masters read like a gallery of geniuses. Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, men separated by centuries, united by a single idea, that knowledge is divine, and that the Church's control of truth is not the same as truth itself. The Vatican has always denied such connections, yet each denial seems to deepen the mystery. Because when researchers in the 20th century began investigating the roots of this legend, they stumbled upon something extraordinary. Documents filed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, detailing the supposed lineage of the Priory of Chaon, including evidence of its guardianship over a sacred secret, the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And though historians later called the documents forgeries, the questions they raised refused to fade. For if the forgeries were planted, who planted them? And why? Was someone trying to fabricate a legend? Or to distract from the possibility that the legend had already been found? In the Vatican's hidden library, deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, lie tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts. Some are cataloged, most are not. It is said that only the Pope and a few chosen archivists know the true contents of the deepest vaults. There are rumors of papal letters referencing secret gospels, of censored documents from the Council of Nicaea, of early Christian sects that worshipped the feminine aspect of the divine. Some claim that buried among them is a collection known as the Magdalene Papers, a set of letters and scrolls that describe her as Christ's wife, his equal in spirit, the true vessel of his legacy. No one outside the Vatican has ever seen them, but a few historians have spoken quietly of glimpses of whispers, of passages copied by hand centuries ago. One phrase is said to appear more than once. The bride and the teacher shall walk as one, and their light shall not be divided. If such texts exist, they would rewrite the very foundation of Christianity. They would prove that the Holy Grail was not an object of worship, but a lineage of knowledge, a living truth passed from generation to generation, hidden from the world not out of evil, but out of fear. Fear that the faithful would no longer kneel before men alone. And so, century after century, the Vatican's silence became its shield. Every artist who hinted at the secret, watched, Every scholar who questioned the archives discredited. Every revelation dismissed as fiction, until one day, a modern writer connected the forgotten dots, and the church once again heard the echo of a truth it had buried. The Da Vinci Code was not the first to tell the story. It was only the first to reach millions while they were still awake. And that is what frightened the Vatican most. Because once a secret leaves the walls of power, it cannot be locked away again. Imagine the silence in those marble halls when the book became a global phenomenon, translated into over 40 languages, read in whispered fascination by the very faithful it sought to question. The Vatican responded swiftly. Interviews, denouncements, official statements. They called it fiction, but their tone was fear. For in the quiet corners of the world, people began to wonder, what if the painting was not just art? What if the feminine divine truly was erased? What if the church had rewritten not sin, but history itself? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, what if the truth was never meant to be hidden? Tonight, as you listen, you can almost feel it, that soft current beneath the centuries. A pulse of something ancient and alive, moving through art, through memory, through you, because truth, once seen, cannot be unseen, and what lies hidden in the dark has a way of finding the light. There is a strange comfort in patterns, because when history repeats itself, it tells us one quiet truth, that what was hidden once will always try to be seen again. The story of a Da Vinci Code is not unique. It is an echo, a reflection of moments the world has already lived and forgotten. For every time truth rose from the shadows, the church answered with silence. And yet, the same themes appear again and again. In art, in architecture, in the quiet corners of faith. If you look closely, you'll find the same symbols woven into the cathedrals of Europe. Not the grand stained glass of saints and angels, but the small carvings tucked into the stone. A rose blooming beside a cross. A woman cloaked in light, carrying not a child but a book. An M hidden at the base of an altar. Coincidence, perhaps, or the language of those who still remembered this sacred balance between man and woman, teacher and companion, Christ and Magdalene. Even in the structure of the cathedrals themselves, the geometry whispers. The pointed arches rise like prayers, but the rose windows bloom like hearts. Circle and cross, sun and seed, masculine and feminine, locked forever in silent harmony. And at the very center of this architecture lies a secret the builders never wrote down, that these churches were not only houses of God, but maps of heaven and earth united. The same balance Leonardo painted, and the same harmony that Da Vinci Code dared to name. The church called these ideas dangerous, but the Masons, the artists, the poets, they called them truth. Throughout the Middle Ages, groups of thinkers carried these beliefs in secret. They were called heretics by the church, but seekers by history. The Cathars, the Templars, the Rosicrucians, and perhaps, centuries later, the Priory of Chaon. Each group carried a fragment of the same forbidden idea, that divinity could not be contained by hierarchy, and that the feminine was not sin, but source. The Cathars were among the first to fall. They believed that the material world was corrupt, that the divine was pure, and that women could be priests, teachers, even prophets. For that belief, they were destroyed. In the year 1209, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against them. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in southern France, their libraries burned, their teachings erased, and yet their symbols survived, passed quietly into the architecture, the legends, the songs of those who remembered. One legend speaks of the treasure of Montségur, the last Cathar stronghold. When it fell, a small group escaped under the cover of night, carrying something they called the Grail. No one ever found it, but some say it was never gold. It was knowledge, perhaps the same truth that Leonardo painted, and the Vatican buried. Centuries later, those same symbols appeared again. this time in the works of Renaissance masters. Raphael, Michelangelo, Botticelli, each one a servant of the church. And yet, within their art, you can feel resistance. A gentle rebellion painted in light. Michelangelo, forced to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, filled it not just with saints, but with symbols of creation, balance, and intellect, a celebration of the divine spark within humankind. The very roof of the Vatican, painted as a hymn to the unity between flesh and spirit, man and woman, God and creation. Perhaps he understood, as Leonardo did, that holiness cannot be caged. Even the floor plan of St. Peter's Basilica hides meaning. From above, it resembles a key, the key of heaven. But some architects have whispered that the key is not only to heaven, but to hidden truth, a map of the ancient mystery schools, encoded into sacred geometry. Every line of history leads back to one question. Why does the church guard knowledge that claims to honor the same God? Why erase stories of balance and partnership? Why turn Magdalene from apostle to penitent? Perhaps because power does not share easily. Perhaps because in the union of man and woman, teacher and student, the church saw something it could not control, equality. And so it divided them, erased her, and built 1,000 altars to the silence that followed. But the symbols remained, hidden in art, woven into architecture, sung in whispers, painted in shadows. Even Leonardo's notebooks speak of it. Pages of mirrored writing about proportion and creation, the divine in human form, the circle within the square, the marriage of opposites, the same sacred geometry that mystics used to describe the union of heaven and earth. He once wrote, "Where the spirit does not work with the hand, there is no art." But perhaps he meant something more. That true art is not simply painted. It is revealed, and that revelation, like truth, is often forbidden. The Da Vinci Code awakened the world to these forgotten connections. But it was not just a story about art. It was a mirror held up to the patterns the church hoped no one would notice. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. That fiction only mirrored what faith once knew. The sacred feminine hidden within the masculine divine. The Grail as a symbol of life, not relic. The balance erased to protect power. History repeats its silence. But silence has its own way of speaking. In every age, there are those who rediscover what was lost. Painters who speak in color. Poets who dream in truth. And seekers, like you, who listen to the spaces between words. Because the hidden faith, the one that honors both halves of creation, was never truly destroyed. It sleeps in paintings, in myths, in cathedrals, and in the quiet questions of every mind that dares to wonder. And when you begin to see the pattern, the parallels between the book, the art, the history, you realize something simple and unsettling. Maybe the Da Vinci Code didn't invent the story. Maybe it remembered it. And if the past can be remembered, then no truth is ever truly lost. Because what is sacred never dies. It only waits to be seen again. The Vatican has always stood as a fortress of marble, of doctrine, and of secrets. Its walls have witnessed more than empires, more than faith. They have watched the tides of knowledge rise and fall, and decided which truths may live, and which must be buried. From the outside, the city glows golden in the Roman sun. But deep beneath those shining domes, in the catacombs of history, lies the heart of a quieter war. A war not fought with swords or armies, but with silence. For centuries, the Vatican's greatest weapon has not been the cross or the crown, but control of the story. They call it the archive, a labyrinth of sealed vaults, stretching for miles beneath Vatican City, corridors of locked doors, rows upon rows of ancient shelves, and a stillness that feels almost alive. Inside rest more than 12 centuries of documents, papal decrees, letters, forbidden books, lost gospels, and texts so old their language itself has vanished. The Vatican calls it a library, Historians call a vault, but perhaps it is something else. A memory buried alive. Few are allowed to enter. Even fewer are allowed to read. Every visitor must request specific documents by name. But how can one request what one does not know exists? That is the beauty of control. To hide a secret, you do not need to destroy it. You only need to make it invisible. And in those vaults, some believe, lies the proof. The evidence that the church has long fought to silence. Manuscripts that speak of Mary Magdalene's role as an apostle. Letters suggesting that Jesus' followers saw divinity not as hierarchy, but harmony. Documents that would turn faith from obedience into balance. The church calls these apocrypha, but to those who study them, they are fragments of a forgotten truth. Among the rumored texts is something known as the Gospel of the Beloved, a manuscript said to tell the story of a union, not between man and woman, but between human and divine. Some whisper it was once part of the Nag Hammadi scrolls, hidden away before the church could destroy it. And there are others, letters between early bishops, debating how much of the truth the world should see. One line allegedly reads, "Not all can bear the full light, so let them sleep beneath the shadow." It is the same logic that has guarded the Vatican silence for more than 1,000 years. But silence does not erase truth. It only delays it. Throughout history, there have been moments when that silence cracked, when light escaped through the smallest opening. In 1945, near the Egyptian desert town of Nag Hammadi, farmers unearthed a jar filled with ancient scrolls. Among them were texts long thought destroyed. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary. Each one told a story different from the Bible we know. A story where Mary Magdalene is not a sinner, but a teacher. Where salvation is not through obedience, but through understanding. And perhaps most dangerously, where God is not only Father, but also Mother. These discoveries shook the world of theology, but the Vatican called them Gnostic heresy and urged caution. To this day, the Church does not include them in its sacred canon, because to accept them would mean rewriting the foundation of power itself. Leonardo knew this, so did the artists before him, and the thinkers who followed. They all sensed the same truth, that faith had been edited, that the divine story had been pruned, until only one version remained, the version that served authority. And the Da Vinci Code merely painted that suspicion into modern words. That is why it struck such a deep chord, because beneath the fiction, people recognized the feeling that somewhere truth was missing. The Vatican's response was swift. They condemned the book as blasphemy, as an attack on faith itself. But in that fury, they revealed something unexpected. Fear. Fear that people might start to look too closely, might start to question too deeply, might start to see the seams of the story. Because when you follow those seams, you begin to see how carefully the tapestry was stitched, how centuries of councils, translations, and politics shaped what billions would come to call truth. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD chose which Gospels would survive. Others were declared heresy, their followers silenced, their scrolls burned. And yet, in every burned library, in every banned book, the same whisper remains, that Jesus and Mary were never meant to be divided, that the true message was unity, not hierarchy. The Vatican's archives still guard this legacy. It is said there are chambers never opened since the Middle Ages, scrolls sealed in wax, letters written in cipher, and papal decrees ordering the destruction of entire teachings. When asked about these archives, church officials say the restrictions are for preservation. But perhaps what they are preserving is not parchment, but power. Imagine walking those halls in the dark, the smell of dust and candle smoke, rows of forgotten knowledge stretching into infinity. Somewhere in that silence, beneath centuries of dust, might lie the answers to questions we are no longer allowed to ask. What if the church's greatest secret is not what it reveals, but what it hides? What the Da Vinci Code wasn't blasphemy at all, but prophecy, a story meant to wake the sleeping truth, because history shows us one thing. When truth threatens power, it is called heresy, and when power feels fear, it builds a wall of silence. That silence still stands, but the cracks are growing. Every rediscovered text, every uncovered symbol, every question whispered in the dark, brings the world closer to the truth. The Vatican hoped to bury forever. A truth not of rebellion, but a balance. Not against God, but closer to God than fear ever allowed. Perhaps that is why these secrets were hidden. Because if the world remembered the full story, faith would no longer need a gatekeeper, and power built on control would finally fade. The Vatican's silent war was never just against heresy. It was against memory. But memory, like truth, always finds a way to rise. The centuries passed. Empires fell. The church changed robes, changed faces, changed names, but not its silence. And yet, silence has a strange weakness. It echoes. It draws attention not by what it says, but by what it refuses to. In our time, the echo has grown louder. From scholars, from codebreakers, from quiet Vatican insiders, who began to see the pattern repeating itself. Because even today, the walls of the Holy See still hide doors that no camera has entered. Rooms sealed behind layers of protocol and prayer. Corridors where cardinals walk with keys older than the countries they govern. Officially, these rooms protect the sacred history of faith. Unofficially, some believe they guard something far more delicate. The proof that the Da Vinci Code was never entirely fiction. In 2012, an Italian journalist named Gianluigi Nuzzi published leaked Vatican letters. The world called it Vatileaks. Buried within those papers were traces of an internal war, not between believers and atheists, but between truth and control. One letter spoke of an unnamed archive file containing apocryphal material pertaining to the Magdalene question. Another mentioned a vault in the Apostolic Library, sealed since the year 1896. The Vatican dismissed it all as rumor, but those who had seen the real documents said the handwriting was authentic. No one dared to ask again. And yet, the curiosity spread. In Paris, a team of art historians studying Da Vinci's sketches noticed something strange. Subtle geometry hidden behind his figures. Lines that pointed not just to anatomy or art, but to places, coordinates. They led to ancient monasteries in Provence, France, regions once home to the Cathars, a sect the church had eradicated for worshiping a god that was both male and female. In those ruined abbeys, the historians found fragments of iconography that matched Da Vinci's own notes. Symbols of balance, circles within circles, and a figure resembling Mary Magdalene, standing equal beside Christ. It seemed impossible, and yet, Da Vinci's genius was not only in art, but in encryption. He hid truth where only those willing to look beyond beauty could find it. The Vatican has never commented on these discoveries, but each time such findings surface, something quiet happens. Permissions to study certain manuscripts are revoked, archives close for restoration, and scholars disappear from the project lists without explanation. Coincidence, perhaps, but history has taught us that the Vatican never believes in coincidence. And so the whispers continue about a vault called Archivum Secretum Section 5. The rumor says it holds documents recovered from the Knights Templar, maps, letters, and coded diagrams that speak of a secret lineage descending from the time of Christ. The Templars, of course, were destroyed by the church itself, but before they burned, some say they sent their greatest secret north, to France, to the land where Da Vinci was later born. Imagine the poetry of that, a circle completed across centuries. The church that buried a truth in one age, unknowingly inspired an artist to resurrect it in another. Perhaps that is why the Vatican fears stories like the Da Vinci Code, because stories have power. They awaken what even history tried to forget. And in a world drowning in noise, truth travels best through whispers. There have been priests, men of faith, who have spoken quietly of these things. A few have written under pseudonyms. They say there is an understanding within certain orders, a vow of protection, not for the church itself, but for something older. They call it the Magdalene Covenant, a secret brotherhood devoted not to hiding the truth, but guarding it until the world is ready to remember. If this sounds like myth, it is only because myth is the safest disguise truth can wear. And so the Vatican continues its ritual of denial. Each discovery dismissed as misinterpretation, each question redirected to theology, each silence explained by tradition. But truth has its own rhythm. It moves slowly, like time itself, and one day it surfaces, not to destroy faith, but to cleanse it. Even now, new clues emerge. A digital scan of Da Vinci's Last Supper revealed a faint symbol under layers of pigment. Two hands overlapping in a gesture of unity, long erased by restoration. And in the Louvre, beneath the layers of varnish on the Virgin of the Rocks, infrared imaging uncovered something unexpected. A figure once painted beside the Virgin, later covered up, a woman's outline, watching silently from the background. Coincidence? Or correction? Every detail Da Vinci left behind feels like a riddle meant for a future that could finally understand him. A warning whispered through time. That art is not decoration, but revelation. And maybe the Vatican knew that too well. Maybe that is why it feared his brush more than any book. Because art cannot be excommunicated. It cannot be censored once it has been seen. It lives in the eyes of every soul that dares to look deeper. Tonight, as you lie here in the dark, imagine those corridors beneath the Vatican. Imagine the hush of eternity in the air, the glow of a single candle trembling against the marble. Somewhere in that stillness, beneath layers of sealed stone and sacred secrecy, the truth waits, unfading, unforgotten. It is said that at midnight, when the city above falls asleep, you can hear the soft creak of doors in the apostolic library, the sound of time adjusting its own memory. Maybe a priest walks those halls, carrying a key no one else remembers. Maybe he pauses before a door marked Section 5 and whispers a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for courage. Because perhaps the greatest act of faith is not in defending what we are told, but in seeking what was lost. And so the story continues, not in fiction, but in the quiet pursuit of truth that refuses to die as the world above sleeps. Beneath the Vatican, the whispers never stop. They echo through stone and scripture, through symbols and songs, calling to anyone who still dares to listen. And if you listen long enough, you'll realize the truth was never hidden from us. It was hidden within us, in our questions, our curiosity, our hunger to understand what lies beyond the veil. That is what frightens power the most, because truth cannot be buried forever. It only waits for someone brave enough to see it. Somewhere in Rome, beneath 1,000 years of footsteps, the air still hums with secrets. Every stone of the Vatican was placed not just to build, but to bury, not just to honor, but to hide. But secrets are strange things. The longer you keep them in the dark, the more they begin to breathe. And in that stillness, you can almost feel the truth. Watching back, it doesn't scream. It doesn't accuse. It simply waits. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding its mysteries. But what if the greatest secret it holds is not locked in any vault or archive? What if it's something far simpler? A truth hiding in plain sight, woven into art, whispered in prayer, and forgotten in translation? Because when you look closely, the story of the Da Vinci Code was never just about Mary Magdalene or the bloodline of Christ. It was about something older than both. The balance that the world once knew and somehow lost. A balance between knowledge and faith, between the sacred masculine and the divine feminine, between what we see and what we are meant to feel. Long before the church stood in marble, ancient faiths spoke of this duality: the sun and the moon, light and shadow, creator and creation. In those times, God was not one side of the coin, but the whole circle. When Christianity rose, that circle was split. Power demanded order, and order demanded hierarchy. The divine feminine, the part that nurtures, that forgives, that understands, was quietly erased. Mary Magdalene was recast from disciple to sinner. The goddess became a ghost, and humanity learned to pray only upward, never inward. Centuries later, Da Vinci's art dared to restore that symmetry. He painted the feminine not as temptation, but as wisdom, not as the fall of man, but as his reflection. Look at the Last Supper long enough, and you see it. The silent figure to Christ's right, hands mirrored, forming a perfect V, a symbol of union, and of the womb. The church called it imagination, but Da Vinci called it truth. And perhaps that is what the Vatican could never accept. That enlightenment might come not through obedience, but through awareness. That God might not be an emperor above us, but a spark within us. Because if people believe that, then no one would need permission to find the divine, and power built on mediation would simply dissolve. This is the quiet terror that hides beneath doctrine, the fear that faith might evolve. For centuries, that fear has shaped our history. It built walls around questions, locked archives, and silenced voices who saw too much. But the truth is patient. It outlives denial. It finds new storytellers in every age. Artists, poets, dreamers, even novelists. When the Da Vinci Code was published, it was as if that ancient spark caught fire again. Millions read, not because they believed the story was literal, but because something inside them recognized its rhythm, a memory of balance, of something once whole, now missing. And maybe that's what this mystery has always been, a search not for proof, but for remembrance. Because whether or not there is a bloodline, a vault, or a secret gospel, one thing remains certain: truth cannot die. It only changes its disguise. Sometimes it hides in symbols, sometimes in silence, and sometimes in stories told softly enough to reach us in our sleep. Think about it. The church, the archives, the whispers, they are all part of the same dance between hiding and revealing, between shadow and light, between fear and awakening. Maybe the Vatican is not the villain of this story. Maybe it is simply the guardian of a truth too powerful, too transforming for an unready world. Because to know that God is both Father and Mother, light and darkness, human and divine, is to see that the sacred lives in everything. And once that is known, nothing remains ordinary.
And perhaps that is what makes this story more than history. Because even now, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city of Rome sleeps, and the basilica stands empty under the stars, it is said that if you listen closely, you can still hear the faintest echo, the sound of a wooden throne, creaking once in the dark, as if someone unseen has just taken their seat again.
The night is quiet now. The streets of Rome rest beneath their golden lamps. The great dome of St. Peter's glows softly against the stars, a lantern above a city built on faith and on secrets, somewhere beneath that stillness. Deep within corridors no one visits after dark. The air hums with memory. Scrolls sleep inside their glass coffins. Ink faded but not gone. Stories whispering through parchment like breath. They wait, as they always have, as they always will, not to accuse, not to condemn, but to be heard when the world is quiet enough to listen. Perhaps that is why you are here tonight, lying beneath the dim light of your screen, listening to the soft rhythm of a story you were never meant to hear. Because this story was never about conspiracy. It was about awakening. It was never about the church. It was about the human heart. We have always been drawn to mystery, to the things that sleep beneath the surface, to the questions that echo when everything else falls silent. Why? Because mystery is where the divine still breathes. Da Vinci understood that. He painted questions, not answers. He believed the sacred was not in the heavens, but in the human search itself. And maybe that's why his work still feels alive. Because it invites us to look inward, to listen deeper, to remember what we once knew before we forgot. The Vatican has spent centuries preserving and protecting, guarding light in its own way. But perhaps it has also guarded the idea that truth must be given to us, when in truth, it was always within us. We built temples and towers, altars and archives, seeking God in the sky, when all along, the divine whispered quietly from a space behind our eyes. The Da Vinci Code, for all its fiction and fantasy, reminded millions of that whisper. And that is why it was dangerous. Not because it lied, but because it made people remember. Remember that every symbol has more than one meaning. That every story hides another beneath its surface. That every truth waits to be found. Not in cathedrals, but in consciousness. Maybe that is the forbidden truth the Vatican fears most. That one day, we won't need to look to marble walls. To find God, we'll simply close our eyes and listen, because faith is not a cage. It's a journey, and every step you take toward understanding is an act of worship in itself. So now, as your mind slows and your breathing softens, imagine those old doors deep beneath the Vatican, the ones no map records. Imagine them slowly opening, not to reveal darkness, but light. Inside, shelves lined with ancient truths, long forgotten by the world. And at the end of that hall, a single painting, unfinished, its colors faded by time. It shows a man and a woman standing side by side, hands joined, their faces calm, their eyes filled with something vast and timeless. Above them, in Da Vinci's delicate script, 3 words barely visible beneath the dust. All is one. That is the message that survived everything. The message hidden beneath symbols, beneath centuries, beneath fear. All is one. Light and shadow, heaven and earth, faith and doubt, all parts of the same sacred circle. And maybe that's the real revelation, that the story we've been chasing was never about uncovering what the Vatican hides, but about remembering what we already know. So let the mystery rest now. Let the questions drift into stillness. The truth doesn't need to be solved tonight. It just needs to be felt. As you breathe, feel that ancient balance returning. The peace between knowing and not knowing. Between history and dream. Between waking and sleep. The world will keep searching tomorrow. The Vatican will keep its silence. But somewhere within you, the truth will keep whispering. Softly, patiently, like the sound of turning pages in the dark. Because truth doesn't sleep. It waits. And when you are ready, it speaks again. So close your eyes now. Let the candle of thought fade. Let the whispers of time guide you into rest. You have wandered through centuries tonight. Through art, faith, and forbidden memory. And now it is time to return home. To stillness. As you drift, remember this one thing. The secrets of the Vatican. The codes of Da Vinci, the stories that refuse to die, they're not just about the past. They're about us. About our endless need to seek, to wonder, to find meaning in the quiet spaces between words. And maybe that's what makes us truly divine. So sleep now, knowing that every question you hold is a doorway, and every dream you dream is a key. And when you wake, perhaps you'll see the world, not as something hidden, but as something waiting to be understood. Because in the end, the forbidden truth was never theirs to hide. It was always ours to find. Good night. And when you're ready for another mystery, the next story awaits. A secret older than empires, sleeping beneath the sands of Egypt, waiting for you to listen again.